Coming up with preseason basketball just a couple of weeks away for the Brooklyn Nets, we take a look at the current 20-man roster, who sits on two ways, who will claim the last of those positions, and what does it mean for veterans and the maneuverability of Sean Marks as GM heading into the season. We dive in coming up next.
You are Locked On Nets, your daily Brooklyn Nets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Yes, my friends, it is the Locked On Nets podcast right here on the Locked On Podcast Network. It's your team, the Brooklyn Nets, every single day. I am Adam Arbrecht, flying solo on a Monday morning and reminding you that we are, of course, 100% free on all those great platforms, and also that you can start the season with a big return of FanDuel. Place your first $5 bet, and you'll get started with $200 in bonus bets guaranteed. Visit FanDuel.com to get started today. And where we get started is starting to narrow our focus in on the Brooklyn Nets and, of course, the upcoming season. Because, listen, preseason is not going to matter as much to the Brooklyn Nets as it may to other teams and key positional roster decisions that they're going to make. But from a developmental standpoint, we are going to learn a lot more about the Brooklyn Nets when it comes to having 4 preseason games, starting with the LA Clippers on October 8th and then working their way through all the way to October 18th with the Toronto Raptors. You also got the Wizards and the Philadelphia 76ers mixed in there as well. Now, before you get to the regular season, which will kick off on October 21st with the Atlanta Hawks on the road, first home game, as we talked about, now feels like months ago when the schedule was released, Milwaukee Bucks. Who doesn't want to have the Milwaukee Bucks in for a visit in your first home game as you continue to work your way through what will be a tumultuous season from a fan joy standpoint, but a calm one from the outlook of getting to that draft and getting hopefully that high draft pick and starting to reset the future of this franchise. But that being the case, we also have to look at how this roster is going to shape up for Brooklyn when it comes to training camp and it comes to the overall construction of this roster. Now, we've already had a handful of players come in here when we look at where the Nets currently stand versus where they're going to be on opening night and maybe where they'll be when it comes to the trade deadline. So looking at this roster as it stands right now, you have 20 players on this team. You have the key guys, obviously, at the top of the roster, the Simmons, the Claxtons, the Johnsons, during FINNEY-SMITH, the Schroeders, and, of course, the Cam Thomases of the world, Noah Clowney, and Jalen Wilson, chief among the young players that we're excited to watch this upcoming season. But as you work your way down the list, you get into this more interesting situation or interesting set of players here, right? As it stands right now, the Nets have occupied 2 of their two-way contracts already this season. When we look at the 4 players essentially that were kind of being talked about inside of it, you do have Killian Hayes, who we'll talk about in a little bit here, and Tyrese Martin, who are both going to be on the two-way contracts coming into camp. But then you have Amari Bailey just signed for training camp. You also have you're also going to have, Jalen Martin, and then Youngji Jackie, as his nickname goes by, and then Shui is the pronunciation, I believe, of his last name as of right now, trying to confirm that as best I can. He's already on a two-way contract, though, as Jackie, along with Jalen Martin. So those are your 2. You have one more two-way contract to give out here. Killian Hayes on a Exhibit 10 contract, along with Tyrese Martin, not going to be eligible, Killian Hayes, for a two-way deal here. And I don't think that would be a likely outcome for him, regardless of what we think his career has been, what it's going to be. I don't know where it would go next for him if he didn't make the opening day roster for the Brooklyn Nets, what he would try to do in order to continue to pursue his NBA career. But there is at least a discussion about how are you going to occupy the rest of this roster and what decisions are you going to be willing to make financially, specifically if you're Sean Marks, in order to ensure, one, that you give the young players that maybe show up here in camp the opportunity, that 2, you keep yourself in a position potentially going to the season to be able to take on those other contracts from around the league when people want to shed their bad money. And then you also just have to look at the developmental standpoint. When will we see some players get bigger opportunities? Down at the back end of this roster, you also have to talk about Keon Johnson. I think everybody, or at least a big segment of the fan base, has enjoyed, has liked, is excited about what he represents and what he could be for this team in that backcourt if he gets some reps. There's noteworthy, as we've already talked about over the last couple of weeks, Ben Simmons, and the fact that he's going to be in, not, everyone's saying 100%. Well, guess what? He's been now all but medically cleared to be 100%. So he's going to go into this camp with no restrictions either. And the reason why I bring even him up into this conversation is because you potentially start to create a bit of a a non-shooting logjam for the Brooklyn Nets, as we've often seen. Now, again, in a year like this, when the wins and losses are not important, or the wins aren't important, the losses are actually critical, it doesn't matter if maybe there's a little bit of clunkiness to the rotations and to how you have to navigate this if you're Jordi Fernandez. But you don't want to, as we've talked about at times on this show, you don't want to find yourself in a spot where developmentally you're struggling to get quality reps for young players because they're being paired with, as good as Ben Simmons at the best version of himself can be, a non-shooting Ben Simmons. Or rotationally, as we said before, the issues you're going to have with Nicholas Claxton and Ben Simmons not being able to share the floor. Now you put Killian Hayes into this mix potentially if he's going to make this roster. Well, that's another non-shooter that you're putting on the floor. Now he's bigger. Could you pair him in the backcourt with Cam Thomas? Okay, sure. All of these things just create, I think, developmental concerns, not concerns about wins and losses, not concerns about who's playing when, but just the idea of wanting to make sure that your starting unit, your bench rotation, have some level of cohesion around them where you feel confident that you're going to be able to have Noah Clowney out there, have Jalen Wilson out there, have Keon Johnson out there. Frank, we kind of compartmentalize him because he wasn't a Nets draft pick, but he's also a former first-round draft pick. Talk about Trendon Watford and wanting him to take his next developmental step. So there's a lot of these other players that are being evaluated for, I think, their long-term future with this organization as you go into that draft class next season, and trying to identify and make sure that these players are all fitting in as they need to. Some may say that whether or not these guys all fit in, or whether or not certain players develop perfectly, maybe in the grand scheme, it doesn't even matter that much, because you're going to be looking at having not just a top, we think, number 1 overall pick, fingers crossed, number 2, number 3, something in there, but that you're also going to have 3 more first-round picks in next year's draft class, that you're also going to have draft picks into the future. So how much of this roster can do anything to cement themselves here is going to be an interesting conversation. But you want to make sure that you put yourself in a spot to give those players those opportunities to earn those roles. And you don't want the veterans to stand in the way. So coming up here in a second, we'll also take a look at the money side of things, where the Nets are currently from a cap standpoint and what's critical for them by the end of this upcoming season to accomplish, and whether or not Sean Marks will be willing to keep some money on the books to get some money off the books. We'll get into that coming up here in just one moment. First, though, got to talk to you, our NFL fans. Maybe you cross over with the NBA as well. You know that right now you can have this season that's starting to roll along, heading towards week 4 now with America's #1 sportsbook. When you get a hunch in the middle of the game, you can check out the latest stats, view live play-by-play, and so much more on the same page where you place your bets. You'll get started with $200 in bonus bets guaranteed when you place your first $5 bet with FanDuel as well. And that's FanDuel.com. You can visit FanDuel.com to look at odds and also think about some of those big plays. Maybe, just maybe, the New York Football Giants on a Thursday night special after getting their first win of the year. Hey, you do what you feel is right for you. But of course, check out FanDuel today. All right, so as we continue talking about the current state of the Brooklyn Nets roster, the financial implications coming into this season, and what's going to happen as we get into training camp. So already, the first thing you can knock off your mind here when you talk about these players on two ways, mentioned Jackie, we mentioned Jalen Martin. They're on the two-way deals. I think you want to see them play well. 6'6" is Jackie. Obviously has some good perimeter shooting for himself. Needs to work on, and this is high-level scout reports that have come in on him, needs to work on his drive towards the basket, can potentially try to carve out a bit of a 3-and-D role for himself. Okay, great. But when you're on the two-way, what we're talking about is, can you be someone who eventually puts themselves in a position to get called up midway through the season, right? We talked about this with Noah Clowney a year ago. We talked about it with Jalen Wilson, excuse me. Like, when are the times going to come for these players, whether you're on the NBA roster waiting for minutes, whether you're in the G League waiting to get called up. So I think that those things matter on that level for any of these guys. But You know where they're going to start. You're not going to pivot from a two-way contract up to being a fixture on the developmental season for the young players in Brooklyn to start the year. So you take those two players out of the equation. Then you start to think about, is there anyone that you're willing to sacrifice for Killian Hayes? And I say that because you sit there at 20, but you get down to, you're sitting there with the two-way deals. So Amari Bailey's been brought in, Tyrese Martin, Killian Hayes, and then even Keon Johnson. And I think the questions now become, is Sean Marks potentially willing to be informed by training camp and informed by the preseason, going to be willing to pay money to make money? There's two specific players here that I think are interesting. Shake Milton, but that money came in guaranteed. It's $2.9 million guaranteed. I'd find it hard pressed to think that he won't be on the opening day roster. Maybe mostly because it's only $2.9 million, so it doesn't really hurt you in any way. The bigger numbers on this roster is someone like Bogdanovic, who's making $19 million. The issue here, as we've talked about in this offseason, is that contracts for veterans, for role-playing veterans, have not been there. So if you're Bogdanovic and the Brooklyn Nets and Sean Marks are telling you, and we also have to assume that the health is there for him, because that's still been a question coming out of last season with the Knicks and coming over, and his role and how it changed and getting moved around on a couple of trades as well. Assuming he's healthy, though, if you're Bogdanovic, what's the number going to be that you would accept on a buyout? Because if you're the Brooklyn Nets, the key factor here, which we'll talk about when we get to the trade deadline and the easy decisions that they can make around other players that are making money on this roster, obviously. But you can't exceed $178.1 million in the upcoming season. And if everybody currently on the roster was getting paid their current salaries, Brooklyn would be within a few million of that. But the more concerning, or the thing that Sean Marks just needs to make sure he navigates and has easy ways to do so, is keeping the payroll under $170.8 million to avoid paying the luxury tax. Any tax payments this year would be modest, but any amount over the tax threshold would limit future flexibility and count against the repeater provision that we've gone through carefully as all these new rules and restrictions come up around the NBA. So now you're Sean Marks and you're saying, well, I obviously have some real flexibility here. I can wait, and we'll talk about the trade deadline. But if I could go right now to Bogdanovic, who I don't think is going to have a role on this team, and I tell him you're not going to have a role on this team, how low can I get the buyout number? Because Bogdanovic is probably looking at it and saying, well, if I take a buyout, I might be lucky to catch on and pick up. Can I make up the $5 to $7 million that I might take on a buyout off of this buyout here? They say they buy him out. He's making 19. Buy him out for 10, for 12. Can I make up that money on a contract somewhere else and then put myself in a better position to earn another contract, right? Because that's really what it's about. If you're going to be stuck on this roster and you're basically not going to be afforded the opportunity to showcase that you still have ability, talent, and value around the league, then you might be willing. This is the classic when we talked about with Ben Simmons. Oh, buy him out. Well, there's no reason for Ben Simmons to accept a buyout over these last few years. He's making $40 million. And there's no world where he was going to take a buyout for any amount of money at this current state with the way his game has been and the injuries and everything else, and then walk into the market and say, and now I'm going to make $30 million a year on a contract over 4 years. It was never going to be there. But for Bogdanovic, there might be some more considerations here for him. Maybe Sean Marks approaches that. And the reason why you might be willing to do that is because you want to keep an open roster spot here. Again, when we walk through it, Simmons, Claxton, Johnson, Bogdanovic, let's keep him in there for right now. Dorian Finney-Smith, Schroeder, and Zaire Williams. You're up to 6. Cam Thomas, Sharp, Clowney. That gets you up to 9. Whitehead right now, but $3.1 million, that's his contract. That's going to get you 10. Shake Milton, Trendon Watford, Keon Johnson. Now you're up to 13, and then Jalen Wilson, 14, right? So you're at 14 right now. The two-way contracts get you to 16. You have one more available spot, and you're making that choice of maybe Killian Hayes. If you want to be able to elevate another one, I think my count was 1 off there, by the way. You have to make a difficult decision about that. So it's going to be fascinating to see how concerned the Nets are about developing young players versus being patient and waiting for that other piece that we'll talk about, which is the trade deadline. And the fact that the Brooklyn Nets can sit here on September 23rd and not care at all about how any of these young guys play or who performs. If you go back to a year ago, Trendon Watford is the guy that stuck when the Nets were taking flyers all over the league and, hey, bring in this young player and let's take a look and let's see who shakes out. Maybe someone pans out. Trendon Watford's the only guy out of 3 or 4 flyers that ended up panning out. So the way that you can look at any of these guys, specifically even the Keon Johnson, which I know is hard maybe for some fans to accept, it's $2.2 million, but it's only $250 guaranteed. Like, the cut and gutting back into the G League, I think another team would probably want to take a look at him. So he's probably outperformed the ability to feel confident about keeping him around if he's not up on the active roster with the NBA. That probably is a factor here for him. But there's not a lot of other guys. Shake Milton making the 2.9 if you want to sacrifice that. All the other young money, all the other low money, Noah Clowney and Jalen Wilson and even Day'Ron Sharp to that extent, and these aren't guys that you're having conversations about anyway. Zaire Williams is making 6.1 guaranteed. So there's enough money here allocated to these guys on guaranteed dollars, whether they're not going anywhere because they're draft picks or via trade or taking these flyers, that you're just going to give them every benefit of the doubt, right? Schroeder is not going to be a guy that gets talked about in this way. Neither is Dorian Finney-Smith, still has value. Age and injury is what brings Bogdanovic, even at that $19 million, into the conversation. So how do you navigate it? Guaranteed dollars are $165.8 million. So you have room. But if the full salaries got booked here, not off that guaranteed money, you'd be sitting right in the 175.4. So guaranteed dollars, still got plenty of room, 13 million, basically, a little bit less, closer to 12 million, available flexibility. All the salaries currently on the roster, 175.4, but they all can't be there. They got to make choices on a couple of guys. Let's take a look here at the upcoming trade deadline in season and why the flexibility may lie in just being able to, quote unquote, cut ties for pennies on the dollar with any of these veteran players and then bring up some of that young talent that you're trying to work through at the G League level. We'll do that here, coming up in just one moment. First, though, passion, drive, and patience. The formula for winning championships is also what keeps your ride or die alive, and eBay Motors has everything that you need to maintain your vehicle and level up to peak performance. Superchargers, roof racks, exhaust kits, LED headlights, and more. Whether you're looking for speed, power, or style, eBay Motors has you covered. With over 122 million parts for your number one ride or die, you'll always find exactly what you're looking for, and with eBay's Guaranteed Fit, your part is guaranteed to fit your ride every time or your money back. Because with eBay Motors, you're burning rubber, not cash. With all the parts you'll ever need at prices you want, it's easy to make your car an MVP and bring home huge wins. Keep your ride or die alive at ebaymotors.com. Eligible items only. Exclusions apply. eBay Guaranteed Fit is only available to U.S. customers. All right, so as we talk about 20 men on the roster, who's going where, we already saw a player who's been in the G League for the Brooklyn Nets, and that was going to be the center, who I'm now, of course, going to lose track of in this moment, but I'll find his name here along the way and make sure that we communicate that he's going to already go back down. They've asked for waiver rights on him, and he'll end up back down in the G League where he's been. So the Brooklyn Nets are already making some of these background moves as it stands. Now, once you get into the regular season and once you are looking around at teams in the league and saying who here currently is looking to dump a big contract, and this is actually why the Bogdanovic piece becomes a little more interesting ahead of the year as opposed to in season. One, because you want to be able to keep a couple of young players on this roster. Okay, fine. Or an extra young player, I should say. But then also because if you can get 6 or 7 million off the books there, and we're talking about sitting right now at 175.4. Can I get myself down to 168.5, right? If I can be sub 170, and then I know I can also move off of another few $1 million when we get to the trade deadline with Dorian Finney-Smith, maybe even including Dennis Schroeder in this. And I think that that's what makes Keon Johnson, such a fascinating watch in this offseason and in training camp and in the preseason. Not because the wins and losses matter, but because if he shows himself capable enough, and if Ben Simmons is going to be healthy and going to be on this roster for the year, you can start to rethink how you look at the depth of this roster on a night in, night out basis. But if I can get myself down to where I have, and remember, money's going to have to come back in on Dorian Finney-Smith. Money's going to have to come back in on Dennis Schroeder to match, potentially. Almost all teams are going to be close enough to that threshold where they're not just going to be able to take on these contracts. We talked about this before, that I don't think Cam Johnson, and Doug brought this up the other day, Cam Johnson is probably like a likely guy just to stay here and just to be here through this entire season. Maybe you revisit it after a healthy year. Good veteran to have. Different category of player in terms of Dorian Finney-Smith, Dennis Schroeder, Bojan Bogdanovic. Like, I think a different type of conversation there. And if you assume that that's all staying, then the ability to move money as quickly as possible, because once you get into the season, you're already paying some of that contract. You know, when you go to the deadline, you don't just get the $14.9 million off the books for Dorian Finney-Smith. You send it out, you bring back something of equal value. So if the Nets in this season want to be able to eat bad money from a team, then they have to make the proactive choices potentially sooner than later. How much can you buy out Bogdanovic for? How much further can you get below that? How many teams have the little bit of extra room so that if, as the deadline approaches, Dorian Finney-Smith goes out, and let's say Dennis Schroeder goes out, if I can start to get myself to 20 to 25 million, now you're having a conversation. In that $20 million range, we went over this the other day. You know, guys like Vucevic is right around that kind of threshold. We can pull it up in the background here. Contracts that might make sense for the Brooklyn Nets if they can just pure eat the money. If the other team isn't taking anything back. You know, we're always talking about getting a draft pick for Dorian Finney-Smith, getting a draft pick for player XYZ. But I got to find myself into a way where I'm looking at players that I can take on because other teams want to dump them, and I can get myself an extra pick or two. You start getting into players that aren't going to go anywhere. Yeah, Vucevic, top of my head there, 20 million exactly, right? So he's going to be a conversation. And that number isn't going to be the same number by the deadline that it represents going into the year as well. Lonzo Ball, are they in or out on him in the injury? Will they have a necessity to just move him off the books when his is expiring? Probably not. Clint Capella coming into the year making over 22 million, right? So there are guys and there are price points that the Nets need to find ways to have the ability to go out and take on that bad money if a team wants to. Now, those are expiring contracts, so that's a little bit different. Maybe a guy like Patrick Williams, who got the big deal in Chicago, he's young, but do they believe in him and where his development's going to be, being locked into $18 million going out year over year? That's certainly one maybe you could think about. And it also comes down to what other decisions get made by these teams around the league. We've mentioned Chris Middleton before. That's a much bigger figure and a much harder one for the Nets to navigate. I think making 34 million this upcoming season, but also has a year out after too. Making 31 this year, 34 next year. If things go totally haywire in Milwaukee and they want to reconstruct, does Chris Middleton offer value to another team? Where is he going to end up? Can the Nets get involved in a 3-team deal where they send a Cameron Johnson if he's not going to be able to be traded, but they see value in him, a Dorian Finney-Smith? Can you start to combine some of these together to send out, knowing that certain teams are restricted, like the Bucks, in being able to, to combine multiple salaries to make match? They can't do that, but they can take in more salaries. They can take in multiple players for one. And can the Nets then maybe pass off a Chris Middleton to a third team and take on their bad contract that they don't want, that Milwaukee can't take one-to-one? So these are all the mechanics that I mean, listen, in the off season, in the dog days of September for an NBA landscape, these I think are real conversations that are going on for the Brooklyn Nets, though. Who do we need to cut ties with now? Who's going to claim that last roster spot for one of the young guys? I guarantee you they are pulling for Killian Hayes to show up in camp, to look good, and to look like a player that they want to bring on for a full contract because he has pedigree, because he represents upside, and because he represents low cost. So now all of a sudden, you've got a bunch of low cost at the back end of your roster, a bunch of youth, and you don't have to worry about any of these other salaries. Think about it right now. I can't remember where the threshold is for the minimum floor. But the Nets right now walking into this season have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14 at this moment. Now, two-way contracts. So let's just say 12. Salaries, $6 million or less with Zaire Williams. The massive money in Ben Simmons of $40 million. But inside of Bogdanovic, Dorian Finney-Smith, Dennis Schroeder, and even Cam Johnson, let's put him in that as well. That's occupying $70 million. And those are all players and names that don't have any bearing on the future. Ben Simmons' money just has to come off the books organically. Just has to run out. Fine. But that's $70 million. When that money moves, now there's $100 million on your books and another $40 million coming off in Ben Simmons. And we know that cap floor, right? I'm talking about having, $60 million on the books in all of these other players combined. Less than that when you go in and crunch the numbers down, right? There's nothing there on these books currently. Nicholas Claxton is what makes up the big chunk, the 28.4. He's going to be here, we believe, at least for the next couple of seasons at a minimum with the sending money on his deal. There's going to be no money. There's going to be nobody making salaries. And I think it's good to be proactive if you're the Nets. I think it's good to try to thread the needle on getting young players that maybe got overpaid. I mentioned Patrick Williams. I don't know where that stands, right? But in the event that they don't want to have that money occupied, Chicago's going to be in a similar situation that the Nets are, shedding contracts, Vucevic otherwise, and then letting some bad money maybe play itself out if he doesn't develop as they hope. But if you can get anybody under 25 years old that maybe is making too much money right now, and then be able to play him out for a couple of years and see if it works out, you're going to need all these contracts again next year. Not these players, but you're going to need contracts like this. You need a Bogdanovic making $19 million. You need a Dorian Finney-Smith making $15 million. That's probably why Cam Johnson stays here, because we need somebody making in the $20 million range. Even the extension, we just talked about Cam Thomas the other day, even with the extension for Cam Thomas, whatever that number is going to look like, even if it's in the $15 to $20 million AAV range, you're still going to need more. So that's what I think is fascinating about how Sean Marks and the Brooklyn Nets view some of the players currently on their roster. And ironically, big money like Bogdanovic, player option for Dorian Finney-Smith, money like that, it's almost, you might wish that you had at least 2 years, right? At least 2 years on all of these bad money contracts, because you know you're going to need it again. And there's always teams that want it. There's always teams that need to shed it. And there's always a team, the Brooklyn Nets, who are going to be willing to take on that bad deal and get a little something extra in the process. There was a couple of interesting notes put out about a potential three-way trade that I saw reported, I think, in Sports Illustrated. We'll get into that maybe on tomorrow's episode, talking about the Pacers and talking about the Orlando Magic and talking about the Brooklyn Nets being beneficiaries of that. So be sure to tune right back in here tomorrow as we continue to figure out who we think can make the roster, who will make the roster, and who needs to make the roster to make sure the Brooklyn Nets have the right money and the right flexibility going into the upcoming season. But as I said, man, 2 weeks away. We're 2 weeks away from some preseason basketball, October 8th. That's going to be a lot of fun to watch. I don't care whether or not the Nets are going to win under the 18.5 over-under win total this season or not. There's going to be a lot of players to look at in this preseason run to figure out who's going to be making that final run to the roster for the start of the regular season against the Milwaukee Bucks. I'm excited. I hope you are too. In the meantime, get over to YouTube. Go ahead and turn on those alerts so you know we're going live. Get us on your podcast feeds. Doug always wants you to know. Leave that glowing 5-star review. Leave a great comment. Don't do anything else. Great 5-star review. Amazing comment. Nothing else. And then, of course, support us in all the other great ways. At Doug Norrie on X, at Adam Armbrecht, at Locked On Nets as well. We'll be setting up again for another Fan Take Friday. We talked about a couple of them last week. Keep throwing them in. We'll keep hitting those as we work our way towards the regular season as well. And as you know, when there is no Doug Norrie, there is no quote short of saying that I miss my friend and I can't wait till he's back so we can keep talking. Ooh, messed it up right at the end. But we will keep talking. All things Brooklyn Nets basketball. Basketball.